Okay, today we're going to be talking about what is biodiversity. So our objectives today are to describe the diversity of species types on Earth, relating the difference between known numbers and estimated numbers, and then list and describe 3 levels of biodiversity and explain 4 ways in which biodiversity is important to ecosystems and humans, and then finally analyze the potential value of a single species. Okay, so a world rich in biodiversity. So biodiversity kind of has a few different definitions. Um, Basically, the short definition is going to be that's short for biological diversity, but biodiversity can also be referring to the variety of organisms in a given area. It can relate to the genetic variation within a population, the variety of species in a community, and then finally the variety of communities in an ecosystem. So depending on which level that you're talking about in biodiversity is going to depend on which definition you're using. And in the next few slides, I'll be talking about what are the levels of biodiversity. So obviously certain areas of the planet are going to have more biodiversity than others. So if you're thinking about the tropical rainforest, you're going to have a much greater variety of species than, say, up in the tundra or in Antarctica or something. And that's just going to be because if we think about our energy pyramid here, so if you remember the plants are a foundation down there, and then your consumers or what are dependent on your plants. And so if you have a larger foundation down here of your pyramid, then that's going to lead to a larger number of consumers. So, in a tropical rainforest, you have a lot of sunlight, you have really rich soil, and so that leads to, and you have a lot of rain, and so those factors together lead to large amounts of plants, which can then, if you have a large amount of plants, that allows there to be a large number of consumers that can rely on those plants for energy. Compared to, again, someplace like Antarctica where the temperature is really, really cold, not quite as much rain, and so you're not going to have as much plant growth, which means you're not going to have as many consumers, which means your biodiversity is going to be lower. It's important that we understand and preserve biodiversity because we'll kind of get into a few of the specifics later on. But okay, so first off, when you're talking about biodiversity, you kind of get an idea of just how diverse the Earth is. Just how many species of organisms do we have, and so the number of species known to science right now is about right under 2 million, and most of those are going to be insects. Whereas we don't know the actual number of species on Earth, but it's estimated to be around 10 million. And so then on the next slide we have this kind of figure giving you just an idea of where we're at with biodiversity. So this orange is our total known, and so for insects you can see that the orange is way above all the other species here. Yet, there's even more yellow. There's more yellow than orange for every single species here, every single type of organism. So, even though we know so much about insects, there's still so much more that we don't know. And even more interesting, if you look at the bacteria, just what percentage that we know of bacteria versus unknown. And so basically the idea here is that there's really much of life that we don't know. And if we, as humans start removing this biodiversity, or removing species from the planet, be it from human causes or just from non-human causes, that reduces the amount of species that we have come to know and that we can study. And a lot of those species are going to have beneficial uses. So plants is where we derive a lot of our medicines from. And just even just general science, just studying vertebrates, studying other types of organisms, we learn more about just general biology that can help us in advancing our knowledge of medicine. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So we'd consider a species known whenever they are collected and they are described scientifically, meaning that we've collected the species, we've kind of taken it to the lab, and we've got an idea of what the anatomy and what the physiology is of that species. And we have unknown species everywhere. I mean, it's not just when we think of unknown species, we kind of think of some lost island or maybe deep in the ocean. But even in Houston, where we live, and in cities around the world, there's unknown species of insects, of bacteria, of even some plants. And some species are going to be harder to study, and so are going to get less of our time than maybe some larger species. So, if you have a certain type of bird that only lives in some remote island, that's obviously going to be a lot harder to get to than if you have, a type of insect that's right in your backyard. Okay, so I talked about the different levels of biodiversity that you can look at it as. So the broadest level is going to be ecosystem diversity. So talking about all the different habitats, communities, and even ecological processes that occur between ecosystems. And then you have, going in a little more narrowly, you have species diversity. So that it's talking about differences between populations of species as well as between different species. So this would be talking about, so between populations of species, this would be maybe comparing the, population of humans in Houston versus the population of humans in Dallas. Whereas ecosystem diversity might be looking at the population of birds on one island versus an island, on some other area of the world. And finally, you have genetic diversity. So that's looking at all the different genes that are contained within all members of a population. So, if you take a population of, say, of a certain species of bird and you look at all of their DNA, it's just comparing all the different variety of genes that they have. And kind of to remind you of some of the biology, a gene, it's a segment of DNA. So I got a picture of it here. DNA made of your 4 base pairs, A, C, G, and T, where A goes with T, G goes with C, that are located on chromosomes, which are just collections of your DNA, and they code for it codes for a specific hereditary trait. So right here, highlighted in yellow, that's going to be a specific gene. So this one gene makes one single protein. So each gene codes for a certain protein, and that protein, they say it codes for a specific hereditary trait because proteins do things in the body. So this could code for a protein that maybe influences the color of your eyes or influences the color of your hairs. And so all along this chromosome, all along your DNA, you have different genes that collectively are going to make you who you are. And so where this comes into play is that, biodiversity, so you could have, if you have a variety of species or a variety of organisms in a population, they're going to have slightly different genes. So again, imagine that this gene codes for eye color. So if you have a population of humans, you could have a certain collection of genes that makes the population have blue eyes, green eyes, red eyes, whatever eye color. And so if you start to reduce the number of individuals in a population, you can begin to limit the number of genes, number of variety of genes in that population. And if you limit that variety of genes, that's going to limit the odds that you're going to have an organism in that population that can survive a certain pressure. And so, kind of what I was talking about, biodiversity affects the stability of ecosystems and the sustainability of populations, because if you're removing the number of different individuals in a population, then you're removing the likelihood that any one population or any one individual is going to be able to survive some sort of catastrophic event in an ecosystem or some sort of maybe new predator that comes into a population. So imagine you had like some sort of a population of birds, and you have a certain predator that comes in that only selects for the birds who can fly really, really well. If you have a a large amount of biodiversity, if you have a lot of different types of birds, you're going to be more likely to have enough individuals in that population that can survive that predator selecting for the slower birds. Okay, so we depend on healthy ecosystems to ensure a healthy biosphere, and that has to do with balancing the cycles of energy and nutrients. And species are part of these cycles. Species influence the cycling of energy and nutrients. And every species plays a role in kind of the food web that is an ecosystem. So anytime a scientist takes any one species and they study it close enough and long enough, they're going to find some sort of important role that species plays in an ecosystem. Meaning that kind of on the surface, we might look at, a species of, turtles, and you might hear that species of turtles is going extinct, and you might think, so what? It's just a turtle. Who cares? And what matters there is that population, that species of turtle, plays some sort of role in that ecosystem. So if you start removing too many types of species in an ecosystem, it's kind of like you're removing a strand in a food web, or you can kind of think of it like removing a block from a Jenga tower, where each time you remove a block, if you remove one block, that might not cause that Jenga tower to fall over, but if you keep removing blocks, eventually you're going to unravel that food web, or you're going to knock down that tower. Specifically, you have a type of species called a keystone species. So this is referring to a species that is absolutely essential to the functioning of that ecosystem, meaning that if you remove that keystone species, that's going to drastically affect the entire ecosystem, more so than another species that might get removed. So an example here is the sea otter. So there was a population of sea otter that this sea otter ended up going nearly extinct. Its population numbers dropped, and the result of that was this sea urchin population began to get to grow out of control, because the sea otter was eating the sea urchins. So you remove the sea otter, then all of a sudden you have a large number of sea urchins. If you have a large number of sea urchins, those sea urchins ate kelp beds, and so if you had too many sea urchins, and all of a sudden they're going to be eating all the kelp beds along the U.S. Pacific coast, and so you're not going to have as much kelp for other animals or for other purposes. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, genetic variation, it's going to increase the chance that some member of the population is going to be able to survive a certain environmental pressure or environmental change. And so if you have a smaller, more isolated population, in other words, a population where you have fewer genetic variation, then they're going to be less likely to survive a certain pressure. Let's maybe you can imagine a population where, say for whatever reason you had to be above 6 feet tall to survive in that population. If all of a sudden you remove just randomly half that population, you might remove all or most of the people that are above 6 feet tall, and all of a sudden that population, wouldn't be able to survive that pressure. So again, all this is just based on probabilities, where if you start removing individuals, you're just removing the likelihood that any one individual is going to be able to survive. Doesn't mean that they can't survive, it's just the likelihood that they're going to survive is going to be lower. And kind of a way that you can think of a population shrinking is as if it's going through like a bottleneck. Meaning, if I jump to the next slide, say you have a population that's this size, and it has 5 different gene types. So you got red, blue, green, yellow, purple, and it goes through some sort of bottleneck. So maybe this bottleneck could be something that, say it has to do with, some drastic storm that kills off, 3 of the 5 genetic types in this population, to where you only have the green and the red that survived. So what's going to happen is you only have 2 different genetic types that are available here. And so these genetic types, you're only going to have 2 different gene types that are going to be able to survive some other pressure in the environment. Or another thing that's going to happen is the green and the red, those are the only two things that can mate with each other. So they can start, you can start having what's known as inbreeding, which is where individuals that are closely related will start having babies with one another. And what can happen with that, and why that can be an issue, is say you have a gene where there's some version of that gene. So say for whatever reason this green genetic type is not a very good genetic type. Say for whatever reason there was some sort of random change in that genetic type that caused the green individuals to not be able to survive very well. Well, if these green individuals start having more babies with other green individuals, then they're going to keep increasing the amount of green individuals in the population that have that poor genetic type. Okay, and that's kind of what this is saying on the previous slide, where as the population gets smaller and you have more inbreeding, you're going to have a smaller variety of genes. And so members of the population are going to have an increased likelihood to inherit certain genetic diseases. Okay. Another reason, and arguably the biggest reason why we care about biodiversity, is because we study species, and especially things like plants, to develop our medicines. So nearly all the antibiotics that we have are derived from chemicals that are found in fungi. We also have new chemicals and industrial materials that are going to be developed from chemicals that exist in certain species. And so, the scientific community is always finding new medicines or new materials that get inspired from studying these species. And so, if you remove the number of species in the world, you're removing species that might hold the cure to cancer, or you might remove a plant that had some chemical in it that was going to be the next new antibiotic. Just to give you an idea of just how important plants are to medicine, here's some common medicines that we use over here, and then the origin of where they come from, and then what we use that medicine for. Okay, and talking about agricultural uses, so most crops around the world are going to originate from areas of high biodiversity. So, a lot of the food crops that we grow, we took that plant from one area where there's a high biodiversity, so a lot of different types of plants. And as settlers, as people moved to other areas of the world, they took those plants with them and they planted them in other areas of the world. And we also have new crop varieties that are hybrids, or they come from taking two plants and combining their genetic material to make a plant, one plant that's better than the two individual plants that make it up. And so if you start removing the number of species of plants, you're removing all these different varieties, all these different options for making hybrid plants. It'd be kind of like if you go to Sonic and you make a drink or something, think of all the different flavors Sonic has to make a drink. So if you start removing the different flavor options that Sonic has to make their drinks, then all of a sudden you're reducing the amount of available drink varieties that Sonic can make, and you could be removing the potential to make some new crazy good drink just because you kept removing the different options to making drinks. And it's also important to note that it's always a bad idea to be depending on too few plants for food, and that's because famines happen all the time. And if you have a famine that targets one specific crop and you only rely on that crop for food, then you're kind of out of luck when it comes to food. So this happened a number of years ago with the Irish potato famine, where the Irish really relied on potatoes for their main food crop, and so all of a sudden you had some fungal disease that knocked out nearly all of their potatoes, and so they weren't left with hardly anything to eat as far as food, and so it led to massive numbers of people dying from starvation, and people had to leave that country, to go to other countries to try to find food. Okay, and this is just a chart to give you an idea of the different types of food and what areas of the world they come from, just to give you an idea of everything that we eat it doesn't all come from Houston, Texas. Things that we eat, you might eat a dish of food that contains an ingredient that came from North America, an ingredient that another ingredient that came from Central Asia, and then two other ingredients that came from India or something. So the idea of biodiversity, the idea of all these diversity of food and their location is important to remember. And the final reason why we should care about biodiversity is just for more of a ethical and aesthetic reason. And that's just that we like the idea of going out and enjoying nature. We like walks along the beach, where you pick flowers, or there's an idea called ecotourism, which is a form of tourism that really emphasizes the conservation and the sustainability of really unique ecological areas. And that's because those areas are they're beautiful areas that people want to go visit, and in those areas, the people that live in those areas rely on tourism to support their economy. And so, if we start losing the biodiversity and start eroding the ecosystems in those areas, then you're going to be reducing the amount of available areas for people to go and travel to. Okay, and that does it for 10.1.